circumstances, we sometimes desperately want to have our old self back that we imagined ourselves to be, right? We desperately want to have that back. And other times, it never comes back, right? So this can be a dreadful moment for us because it could also be, yes, it's dreadful, and it could be difficult when we kind of take in that full scope of the capacity that we never once experience again, but it can also be a moment of opportunity. And I really like to say this because I think this is important. Because when somebody comes to me and discusses just what they've lost, we look at how they've come to identify themselves as, especially, right? And oftentimes it's with their body, So we explore together who they are, of course. We try to look at the identity of a person in a much more broader view. So I often find that it's important to have a bit of a bullseye approach to our identity, and to look at the surrounding circles we have with regards to ourselves, right? So I always like that image. I always think it's a good metaphor, the bullseye, because I often tell people, you still get points even if you don't hit the middle. So I often find that that's especially important to remind people of. And often we're fixated on our physical identities, especially, and we tend to forget the fact that we have many identities. We can have a social identity, we can have an emotional identity, we can have a spiritual identity, we can have a moral identity, maybe a job identity as well, too, right? So there's many different identities we can have. We could name them all, but I don't think we'll have all the time to do that. But generally speaking, I find that, those are the elements that I try to focus on, especially with people when it comes to that. And when you start to look at that, then all of a sudden you start to realize at which point our identities are much more vast, much more bigger than we think, And I think that we can start to see much more clearly in terms of who we are when it comes to that, right? And I'm thinking here of a person that I was working with, actually. This was a military person I was working with, and he had a loss of capacity. And basically, we all know that it's a very physical job when you're in the military, right? You're using a lot of yourself, right? So you can end up getting used up a lot as well, unfortunately. And the thing that, we did with him is, of course, we gave him a bit of a space to talk, to share a little bit more about himself in terms of, who he was, what he's lost, because it's really important to do that. But what we did also is I went a little bit further and I asked him, basically, what is it you enjoy the most? Of course, you can't play the same type of sports that you did before with your friends or your colleagues at work, but what is it you enjoy the most about that? And he said to me, basically, you know what? He said it's the social aspect. He said to me, I really enjoy getting together with the guys after, and just basically just chatting it up and just having a good time after, So I asked him, I said, well, why don't you do that? And basically, it's like a light turned on, and all of a sudden he realized that, that's not something that's being compromised. And if he's not going to some of these after parties, then basically he realized he was the one that was causing that, not necessarily his limitations. So I really thought that was an interesting breakthrough I had with this particular person, especially because it gave him an empowering feeling, especially, and he was able to discover that he could participate and experience a sense of togetherness, of course, So, hello.
Hi.
No worries.
Have a seat, please. So, I think loss of capacity can cause us to make adverse decisions about ourselves. Like we said, we may choose not to go out, not to meet others, and if we're not careful, we can somehow limit our potential, right? And due to our diminished capacity in a lot of ways. And while it's true that we may not have chosen illness or loss of capacity, it's what we do with this that ends up showing us where our choices lie, right? Do we have only one circle of our identity, or do we reach out to the further circles, right? In terms of who we can be, potentially, And when we're not sure of who we're becoming and who we are, it's really important to make sure that we can test our capacities. Knowing the threshold that we have is really important, right? And sometimes the only way to find out is really through trial and error. So some people that come to me and tell me that they've lost a capacity of some sort, of course there's grief. Of course we take the time to sit and talk about those feelings, talk about the loss, right? It's important that we do that. But it's also important to know that, once you start to work with your threshold, then, you can understand a few things about yourself. And if you don't know what your threshold is, what ends up happening is you end up paying for it later, where people overexert themselves. And I find that they borrow from certain places. That's the thing that happens, right? If you overexert yourself, you borrow from tomorrow, right? And that's the thing that happens. And you pay for it the following day or the following days, right? Or your body pays for it in some shape or form, So it's really, really important to recognize certain aspects when it comes to our threshold. And I find that once you start to realize what your threshold is, then you can learn to retrust your body. And it's really, really important to, of course, experience that, a sense of trust with our body. What is our threshold, right? Because, the thing with that, of course, is that we're creatures of habit, right? And this is really important. We need predictability. And I remember I had one client, and he told me that he would go out for brisk walks, but he would not allow himself to go beyond a certain heart rate because he knew just about what his heart rate would cause him to experience, of course, So if it went too high. So he had like his little Fitbit watch, he's going, and he kind of knew what it was, right? And I always enjoyed that because I really felt that was one of the most empowering moments he had, once he found out about that. And for him, that made a world of difference. He would walk with a walking stick, and it was okay, he did a good job, but he was really happy, he was becoming more active, and it was almost as if he was starting to re-embrace life again, And I really think that's important because we forget to do that, right? We forget sometimes to not just look at the spot that's on a painting, but actually look at the whole painting, the whole picture, right? Hence the bullseye approach. So I think that's really important, Some people have told me that it's a time threshold for them. So for them, sometimes it's only working within the confines of a certain time. If they're able to do that, for example, then they know they have only a fixed amount of time. Is it 30 minutes? Is it 45 minutes? Whatever it is. Some people, they have a specific threshold they can work with. They know they can do that. Or there are certain tasks they know they can do that will respect their threshold, right? So it's always about recognizing what are the activities that respect my threshold. Oftentimes that will limit the fact that I'll pay the following day with pain, less energy, or just less cooperation overall with my body. So it's really good to recognize that, And oftentimes I find that it's something that illness does, or loss of capacity does to us, is it causes us to realize that there's a sense of interdependence in life. And I find that this is something that people often forget. When we're young, we tend to think that we're independent, we can live our lives alone, we can do anything we want, right? It's only when we start to age a little bit that we start to see that that's not the case. Like it's obviously that we are interdependent towards other people, We can, and it's okay to rely on other people as well. And we forget about this, And I often remind people that, no one is truly independent. Sooner or later, that person that thinks themselves independent are going to require some help sooner or later in life. And I always find that that's a wake-up call, right? So I just think that that's something that's really important to mention because people tend to forget that. And it kind of reminds me of people that come to me from the military as well. Like I said, I see a lot of military clienteles, I see couples, I see different people, and I find that what happens especially is when people come to me and they're leaders in the military, I find that the best leaders are often the ones that are interdependent-minded, the ones that can bring out the strength in people. Those are the greatest leaders when you think about it, right? It's the ones that inspire us. It's the ones that can really speak to us and make us come out with the best. I find that the leaders that are too opportunistic, that tend to walk over people, those are the leaders that'll probably burn bridges, I find, and perhaps don't understand the notion of interdependence, which is at the very heart of the military. If everybody's doing their job, everybody's doing it correctly, everybody feels validated, everybody's going to go the extra mile. So that makes for a stronger military unit. It also makes for a stronger family unit as well, too. So that's always interesting for me to notice that. So I find that, oftentimes, if we're not careful, we can give in to the inner critic. And I find that, when we have a loss of capacity, it's easy for us to fall into a type of negative thinking state. I'm no good anymore, I'm defective, etc. Whatever type of sentence or statement you come up with, that criticizes you in some shape or form. I always find that it's important that we work on identifying what that belief is, especially. Because if we're not careful, that belief will get the best of us. So sometimes I actually call that naming the beast. It's a little bit like the mythical stories that we hear sometimes, where all of a sudden, if you've named the beast, it loses its power over you, And it's so true when you think about it, because if you're able to put a name to the belief, you can start to observe that belief. You can start to observe when it starts to happen, or when you start buying into it, or you start to live it in some ways. And when you can see it for what it is, you're actually stepping outside of it. So that's super important to be able to do that. To be able to name whatever type of negative belief you can come up with that happens, inside of you, that's especially important. And I find that I often work with positive statements as well. I like to work with positive statements, especially to help people see themselves beyond their limitations. And one of them that I like, of course, is I'm more than I think. One I like to hear from the military folks is 1 foot in front of the other. I like that one, because it reminds us to always keep going, and we forget about that. 1 foot in front of the other. That's how it is, right? Always when we need to get from one place to the next, we're always doing that. So it's at our own pace, and I think that that's really, really important, And actually, when people exit my office, actually in Pembroke, I have a little statement on the whiteboard, actually, and it just quite says simply is, "You got this." So when people walk out, at least they have a little something to know that they can trust in their ability, and that they can leave with more. So I just wanted to mention that. I think that that's especially important. And I guess I'll end that particular part of the talk with a little story by Viktor Frankl. I don't know if some of you know who Viktor Frankl is. Maybe you've heard the story before. I'm not sure whether Reverend Susan said it or not. I'm going to guess that you probably didn't, Susan, so I hope not. So Viktor Frankl basically was a Jewish psychiatrist, basically, and he survived the Nazi concentration camps. And I found it particularly interesting, his story, because the Nazis have had all sorts of ways to play with people's minds, right? They kind of enjoyed mind games like that. And one of the things they do to people is they'd ask them to move a pile of rocks. So say this pile of rocks is over here, say, "Well, we want you to move it over there, in that corner." And then once they got the rocks over there, they said, "You know what, we want you to move it over there. This was over there, I want you to move it over here." And eventually people got fed up. People started saying, "Why are we doing this? What's the meaning behind this, right?" And of course it didn't take much, right? If you said the wrong thing or you did the wrong thing, that was it, So, it wasn't obviously easy. It was extreme and dire circumstances. But what Viktor Frankl did, because he managed to survive that, he said how he did it was that he would take the rocks. He said he didn't have a choice to take the rocks. He said, "I'm going to take these type of rocks that are shaped this way, I'm going to put them over here. See the yellow rocks there? I'm going to put the yellow rocks over here." So basically, he would make a game out of it. Just like that, And he knew that he was being watched at gunpoint, And basically, he just went ahead and did that. And he said that that was a saving grace for him. He said basically that that was what helped him to maintain his sanity, ultimately. And I actually went to the 100th anniversary of Viktor Frankl's death, actually. In Ottawa, there was one of his students, I think it was Rabbi Reuven Balka, late rabbi who did CFRA, actually. Sunday nights with Rabbi Balka there, I believe it was. And I really enjoyed his talk, but I really, really liked the last statement he made. He said basically Viktor Frankl's philosophy is summed up in the following words: "You make the best of it." And for me, that really hit home. Because every time I get down on myself, every time I'm faced with adversity, every time I get the sense that I'm just crushed with regards to certain things, I tell myself, "You make the best of it." So I think that that's a really important statement to remember when it comes to that. When it comes to loss of capacity, when it comes to any type of losses. Of course, we don't need to go through what he went through. but we can still take a lesson from that. So that is what I had to say for loss of capacity for now. Now the next one is the loss of a loved one. As I said, I hosted a lot of grief counseling groups, and this is one of the most difficult losses that we can experience, of course, because our realities are not quite the same as before when it comes to that. And we can experience all sorts of feelings associated with loss or the impending loss of a loved one, for example, right? Namely denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Like these are the stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And some of you may know about those stages already. We hear often about these. And this is more in popular culture now. I'm going to get into another type of theory on grief a little bit later in my talk, and I want to talk to you about that as we move along, so I'll get to that soon. Now, as we age, we get the sense that our circles become smaller and smaller, and the thing that happens with that is we start to see people pass away in greater numbers. And this is the type of experience that can shake us up and cause us to feel as though our worlds are suddenly shrinking. Now, I don't like to put a number on this, but I find that generally speaking, once we hit 40, it starts to accelerate a little bit more, right? We might still have some losses before then, but I find that I've noticed that, especially with some people and myself, especially that losses do increase, a little bit more as we age more and more. So the thing with that is that sometimes we can have a grace period. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we can have borrowed time with some loved ones before they pass, right? And in cases like this allows us to explore the eventual departure of a person, right? And when the loss is sudden and unexpected, it's difficult for our minds to adjust because as people, we're not made for too much radical change, right? As we said earlier, we're creatures of habit, right? And change in too much short time is just doesn't work very well for us, and especially involuntary changes such as sudden death, But I often find that when we experience grief, one of the things that I like to say to people sometimes is that there's a paradoxical sense of relief that's mixed in with sadness, especially, and we tend to forget about that. That there can be relief that the person that's suffering is finally has an end to that. And I think it's really important to mention that because that you have mixed feelings about that is okay. It doesn't mean that we love somebody any less, And, I think that it's really important to realize that. And I remember when my mom passed away myself, and of course it was devastating. My whole world got shook up, of course, and I couldn't believe it that people around me just carried on, It's like the whole society just kept on going. And it's like, I felt like shaking everybody I met. And it's like saying, don't you realize what's happened here, And my whole world was just, upside down. But I remember feeling that. I remember feeling that love and the idea that things would never be the same again. But I also remembered having a huge relief in seeing my mom pass because of the fact that, of course, it would end her suffering in that way. So I do think that if we do know ahead of time, some people might not enjoy that particularly. It can be very dreadful to know that the person's on borrowed time with us, but yet at the same time, it allows us to finish things and perhaps have the conversations that need to be had. And we tend to forget about that, but it's there. And it really does help us ultimately to be able to, I'm going to say, wrap things up. And as strange as that may sound, because there's never really any complete wrapping up, of course, but we try to at least get some things in order, of course. And I also like to think that it's also normal that once the loss happens, once the person passes, it's perfectly normal for us to shut down, We tend to be concerned about that. Am I shutting down too much? Is there a problem with me? And I just like to say to people, oftentimes this is normal. This is part of the shock that we have, and we forget about this. I think that this is something that's especially important for us to remember and to realize, of course, and it's can be a really intense experience that hits us, but it's also normal to want to escape our feelings. Especially when we're having negative feelings, it's normal that we want to escape that. That's part of the process. And the type of escape that can sometimes happen is the shock. It's like that buffer that we start to have over ourselves all of a sudden, So, I always like to tell people that it's important to integrate with the event, of course, And yes, there's a possibility in getting lost in avoidance, right? Because it can happen to some of us, that we can get lost in avoidance, right? Where feelings are unpleasant, they're just too painful, and we just don't want to feel them. But yet they're necessary for our well-being, And that's the thing that happens. If we don't feel our feelings, we tend to dismiss them, brush them away. They tend to come out in an unhealthy way, right? And this is where my work starts to happen sometimes, where people choose to consult with me because of the fact that they haven't quite dealt with their feelings or don't quite know how to do that, because perhaps in some family settings it's not well looked upon in some ways. Perhaps they've been dismissed, in terms of how they feel. Perhaps they've been made to feel less important. So all of a sudden, you've got people adapting themselves and trying to shut off a fundamental part of their lives. And they need to, of course, connect to that. They need to make that real, of course, in as much of a healthy way as possible. So that's why I always tell people it's okay to feel our feelings. And of course, they can be contradictory feelings, and that's okay. Feelings don't need to be logical. It's perfectly fine that we have many feelings that can, of course, override us in a lot of ways, but that are contradictory. And, as I said, I did say to one person, at one time, and I said to her that it's perfectly fine that you're angry at that person that left, and that you're angry at them, especially for leaving you alone with those people, and then she started crying, because she understood, and I was able to speak her language in the sense that I shared with her that I had a similar experience myself too, in my own losses, and when we have someone that we love all of a sudden go, and that we're left with some family that doesn't quite get us the same way that that person got us, it's hard. It happens to us, and it's okay to say that. I think it's all right, and it doesn't make us bad people to think that way. We're not a bad person for thinking that way, for being angry at them for leaving us. It's part of the process. We're adjusting to that absence and to that loss. So it's really, really important to, of course, to connect with that, and oftentimes I like to name certain things that go on that way, and it is, of course, a way to integrate with that reality. And oftentimes I find that what happens is, it's a delicate balance when it comes to feeling our emotions, because the idea, of course, is to feel our emotions, but it's also to make sure that certain emotions don't consume us completely. And that's another problem that can happen with some people, is that maybe you've known some people where their emotions tend to be the only thing that is within them in that way. And there's work that's necessary when it comes to learning to, of course, contain that, to have our emotions in a container of sorts, so we can feel them, right? It's important to feel them, but we don't want to have them become the only thing that we have within ourselves. And that's a lifelong process. That's a challenge that all of us have to deal with over a lifetime, and to have that balance is really, really important. You don't want to have too much of one, but you don't want to have too much of the other either, so that's really important. Now, I'd like to practice a little exercise with you, actually. I enjoy doing exercises with people, so I'm going to give you a little something to work on today. So we're gonna do a little bit of an exercise here, and just to give you a bit of context about this exercise, some of us have probably lost an object that we may have accidentally broken. Could be a dish or something, a plate or something that we may have just dropped on the floor, or maybe whatever object it is that we just inadvertently broke or something, and of course it's upsetting in the moment, right? When we lose something that a little heirloom or something that we cherish, right? We don't enjoy that, You get frustrated maybe in the moment, and then what ends up happening over time is that we suddenly become okay with it. So all of us have been through that, where we've lost a little object or something, and say, oh, darn it, and eventually, we eventually get okay with it, And it's interesting because this is a part that I really think is important for us, because we all have that. So all of us went into a space inside of ourselves where we were okay. So let's work with that. Let's allow ourselves to move into a similar space where we are okay. I'd like for you to work with that with me today. Just letting yourself migrate into a space within you that is okay. And And that's really important because oftentimes we forget about that. Simply allowing ourselves to go into that space, however subtle it is. It doesn't need to be like a earth-shattering. It can be very subtle. But allow ourselves to go into a space where we're okay. And just breathing in that space. Just being in that space where we're okay. You know? Because we all have an okay space within us. We've all had something that we enjoyed as an object that, you know, we've lost, and that all of a sudden we were able to transition and go into that space. So this is an important resting space. If you can rest in this space right now with me, and just breathe into this space. Just a few moments, breathing into the okay space. I find that when we do that, there's like a calm that comes up. It's like time slows down when we do that. So we all have this okay space. And when I show this to people, people say to me, it's so simple. And I say, yes, it is simple. But at the same time, you know, we forget about doing this. We get so busy trying to solve problems, right? The mind loves to solve problems. It loves to have something to chew on, you know? Like our dog, it just likes to chew on a bone. You know, all the time, it wants something, all the time. Once we slow down and we go into this okay space, you know, we can experience that. We can experience the calm. It's always within us. As long as we give ourselves permission to go there. You know, so whenever we feel overwhelmed emotionally, you know, I had somebody phone me up recently and she told me about that. I said, find your center. Go into the okay. You know, and basically she was able to do that. She was able to simply go into that space. She phoned me the following day and she said, thank you. I said, you're welcome. I knew that that was what was going on. She was just so heightened that there was no reasoning it out. There was nothing that I could say that would make it better. Well, it could have been a few things, but in the end, I knew that that's what she needed in that particular point. So this is something you can work with. And I think that this is an important exercise that we can do, especially if we're feeling sad or the sadness is too much or overwhelms us too much. We can allow ourselves to shift into the okay. And we can work with that. And you can sit with it. And the more you're going to sit with it, the more you're going to feel it. That's the thing, because you're creating neural pathways in your mind. You're creating that pathway, it's going to become easier. So you're training yourself to do that. And it's a great exercise to do. You can do this while you're driving. You can do this while you're waiting in line somewhere. You can do this while you're watching your favorite TV show. You know, so that's the beauty of it. It's a universal type of exercise. So, you know, one of the things I like to do when I sit with people, of course, is I like to ask them to simply tell me who the departed person was. You know, I like to sit down and know who that person is, because one of the things that I think is especially striking and apparent when we experience loss is it's the loss of that person. It's the sense that the person that passed away was so special to us in a lot of cases, you know, that all of a sudden it's like we would like for the world to know at which point this person was special to us, especially when it hurts, you know, especially in those times where it is painful. Because that's the love. That's the love that creates that relationship, that causes us to feel that. So I think it's really important, of course, to create a space where people can tell me. And I ask them, who is that person? Who were they? Tell me, use some words. You know, what did they like to do? You know, what did they say to you that was important? You know? Why did they matter to you? So when we create a bit of a space like that, we acknowledge that. You know, we create a bit of a place where we can talk about that. Because oftentimes what ends up happening is, you know, society doesn't really leave space for this, you know. Society likes to move forward. It's always fast and it's always the next thing, the next thing, the next thing, you know. It doesn't really stop to actually smell the roses, you know, and take the time to really just pause and experience things. And sometimes we need to do that. We need to pause and just take a breather. I once had a colleague come to me when I was at another job, actually, and she'd do this every now and then. I kind of thought that was really nice. She would come into my office and she would actually ask me and sit down. You know, I wouldn't ask her to sit down. She would actually sit down and say, how are you doing? And I was like, wow, okay. And I really appreciated that because first of all, it snapped me out of what I was doing, and it was okay for me to take a few minutes just to chat a little bit about, what it is that that person represented or where I was at with that, So for me, that was really important, And of course, some of us need to talk a little bit more than others, and it's fine. You don't have to be an open book with everybody, of course, but you can still, nonetheless, create moments of vulnerability or allow yourself to have a moment of vulnerability if somebody does ask, And I think that's important to do that, of course, So, I find that it's often good to look at what the various rituals were that people had, of course, before. And one of the things that is important, of course, is these little types of gestures that they had, that they used to do, that can sometimes serve as gateways. And that's really what I like to call them, because they are gateways, to the other person, So, some of them can be something quite as simple as an unfinished project, an action step of some sort. It could be a recipe, it could be a home project, it could be a trip. If there's an unfinished project or something that you were talking about with that particular person, I think it's good to carry through with it, and it could even be a hobby, it could be many things. And I remember actually I had one of my late supervisors pass away, actually, and he was a wonderful person because he really taught me the importance of sitting with people, For me, that was really, really important. And he said to me, when you're sitting with people, take off your expert hat. Doesn't matter. What's important is the relationship, sit with people, And it really made a difference in my work and my approach with people. I'm able to sit with people, and I think people appreciate that, And you don't see that with some people, you get the sense that it's in and out, and there's like little to no contact, or very little interaction and exchange. I try not to be that type of person, I think it's important that we have exchanges and that we're able to talk, of course, So he passed away suddenly, and the thing was is that the timing was just incredible because we had planned a trip to Ireland, actually, together. It's a beautiful country, by the way. If you have a chance to visit it, it's great. It's a wonderful country. People are friendly, food is good. But you know what? I asked myself, should I go or shouldn't I? And eventually I said to myself, you know what? I gotta walk the talk here. I gotta keep moving forward. This is what he would have wanted. And I said, I'm gonna go. And I went, and I really didn't regret it, And I had a little ritual actually with him in my own way, because I don't know if I should share this, but I'm gonna share it anyways, because I trust all of you here, so. I went to the Guinness factory in Ireland there, up in Dublin, and I ordered a beer, and my spouse, she ordered something, and I had a third beer for him. And, it's, it still touches me a lot, because I knew he was there with us. And he was cheering us on for being there. And, of course, I became emotional. It was really difficult, and it really touched me, and it was like a culmination for us that we had that little ritual for him. So I encourage you all to have like little rituals yourself, because it makes us feel connected to people. It gives us that, it gives us that connection with them, whatever ritual it is. It's not for me to say, it's not for me to choose. You get to choose what it is, And if you're willing to do that, then you go ahead with it. You do that ritual, you allow yourself to do it for the sake of the other person, because it makes you feel good, because it makes you feel connected to them. Why not? So I think that's really, really important. So, of course, that little ritual I said to you, that's just between us, right? So I think another aspect that's really important for us is, of course, to do what I like to call an inventory of what the departed person has taught us in life, you know. And I'm not talking about doing this when you're busy doing the funeral and making plans and arrangements and everything. That's not the time to do that. You know, it's after the fact. It's when all the dust settles and then you're sitting down finally and you're saying, now what? Well, now's the time to look at things. Now's the time to decide, okay, well, what is it that they left me? You know, what is it that they've imparted as a lesson in life and how to live, right? And that's a really, really important question. You know, that you can carry on certain things that matter to you in that way, you know. And it's okay that certain things you choose not to carry on. That certain things die with them in that way. That's okay too. There's certain things you may not like about certain habits or certain things they did, and that's fine. You don't need to carry that on. I've seen some people choose to be exactly the opposite of how certain people were in their lives because that was the lesson for them. He taught me how he was when he did that. I'm going to be the exact opposite. And I thought that was okay, you know, because sometimes we need to do that, you know. So there's always lessons everywhere in everything that we do, you know. So I think that that's really, really important, you know, to be able to recognize that. And once you have that, then, you know, you get to choose to carry that within you, right? That's the thing that you can choose to do, is that lives on within you. You know, and oftentimes we say that it's the deceased person lives in our heart, you know. Part of them is with us, you know. But part of them is the habits. It's what we choose to carry on, what inspires us to continue, right? So that's really, really important to be able to, of course, experience that, right? So, of course, there's different ways to experience, you know, different things that the person has within themselves. Do they have an appreciation of beauty, for example, or aesthetics? Do they have a love of learning, for example? You know, is there something that they love to learn? Was there a certain sense of duty in, say, involvement in local organizations, for example? You know, were they funny people? Were they kind people? Right? Were they perseverant? I've had some people in some way tell me sometimes that they started out with nothing in life, you know, and that they ended up with having some acquisitions, you know, but for them it was their perseverance, you know, together that mattered, you know. So it can be that. It can be that you choose to carry that within yourself, you know, and that's really, really important, that you have something that you can carry on. It could be creativity, you know, whatever it is that you choose for yourself is really, really important, you know. Now, what I want to say, of course, is eventually the waves that you'll have are going to become less volatile and further apart. And I really like the image of the waves, you know, because waves are really strong and they can carry us off our feet sometimes. But other times, some waves that we can have, if you've been in the ocean, you know that some waves will just be very strong but won't take you off your feet. And that's how we end up becoming over time, is we can end up braving the waves because the waves will become smaller, right? And what happens is that you can even start to feel feelings that need to be felt, and you can even start to experience joy. You know, a sense of joy and enjoyment will eventually return. So once you start to enjoy life and start to live life, that's a sign that you are allowing yourself to process your grief in a healthy way. You know, that you're able to laugh, that you're able to enjoy life again. That's really important. It's when we're stuck, it's when we get the sense that we're not moving anymore, that becomes a more problematic type of grief, you know. So I guess you'll know you're doing better when it comes to experiencing adjustments that are internal, such as adapting without them, of course, adapting without the loved one, taking responsibilities or learning new skills, as we were saying perhaps earlier. And also on a spiritual level, not just on internal or external, but also on a spiritual level, is you can clarify your beliefs by finding purpose in your life. And that's really an important one too. Who am I now that this has happened to me? Who do I choose to become? Who do I choose to be from now on? So that's what I wanted to say about the loss of a loved one. Okay for time? I think we're good still. Okay. So I'm going to go into what's called grieving a living person. And this is an interesting loss because I've been working with this particular loss for a while now. And you know, this is often described as a hidden epidemic, you know, because most people don't talk about this type of loss, but it happens. You know, and it does create torment within us when we have people that we just don't get along with. In fact, there was a recent statistic I had read that said 1 person out of 3 doesn't get along well with their brothers or sisters. And that's huge when you think about it, because it happens, where we just don't talk with them as much, or that it's a chaotic relationship, So it's really important that we acknowledge that type of loss, and sometimes it even happens that people disappear from our lives, they call this ghosting now, you've probably heard that word. It's one of these new words that's floating around called ghosting, and it's kind of strange because it's like, yeah, they become like a ghost. They're no longer there, right? So they just up and disappear, and you don't get an explanation. So this is kind of the thing that happens oftentimes with estrangement, and that's really the loss of the grief of a living person, because they can exit our lives through different reasons, right? That we won't necessarily be always aware of. Sometimes we are, but sometimes we aren't. Like misunderstandings, disagreements, inheritance issues, for example, is a big one. And sometimes that really brings out the worst in people. They fight or bicker over objects or how things should be. Illness in the family, conflicts with family-in-law as well too, You hear about this type of stuff. Oh, they've changed ever since they're with that person. They're not quite the same anymore. Yeah, okay. So there's some estrangement issues when some people, of course, gravitate more towards one side of the family and less towards the other. So that can also be a sense of loss also over time, So sometimes some people, they like to weaponize estrangement, and they like to make it as if they can get the upper hand over people in some ways. They cease to talk with them, and they expect the other person to somehow know why it is they're not talking to them, So this is the type of stuff that happens oftentimes that's associated to estrangement. And it makes it hard when it's within one's family as well, because, of course, we hope for the best, of course, but it's always a throw of dice when it comes to the family we're born in, right? So sometimes we get lucky, sometimes we don't, So sometimes I find also that with estrangement, it's the other side of the coin. We're not the only ones experiencing estrangement, but sometimes we're the ones having to do estrangement for our own sake of peace of mind, So it happens sometimes that you have to cut off someone from your life just because in some ways they have toxic behaviors, right? And it's not always easy to have to do that, And I work with a lot of people that have these type of issues, in fact, I work with sibling estrangement, and that's an issue that comes up a lot more. I have people I work with from all over the world that contact me and work with me on this, and it's really counterintuitive when you have to do this, where you have to, in some cases, create space that makes that a family member is just no longer able to access you, because, of course, you sometimes have to put up that boundary because you're just fed up having to go over the same things over and over again. And most people that go through this, it's not ghosting. It's not something that happens just spur of the moment like that. It's something that's built up over time. People got to that point where they got fed up, and eventually they had to say, okay, look, that's it, And it's hard when we have to go through that, but I find that it takes courage to be able to do that sometimes, And it's not to do that as a one-up on somebody to get the better of them. It's really about our own peace of mind, And, if we're not careful over time, what happens if we stay with this in some families where this happens is that where we can feel as though sometimes we can be depleted, doubtful of ourselves, and at odds with people that just can't accept us for who we are. Because this starts off in families like that, where there's like these difficulties with some members in the family, and it builds from there, right? And eventually we get disappointed, and in some ways what ends up happening in some ways is that people can feel isolated. They can even shut down if they're not careful, and they can even question their perception of reality as well when this happens. And they can even think that there's somehow something wrong with them. So, if you're experiencing estrangement, or you're part of a family where there's a lot of volatility, and there's negative power dynamics, then oftentimes this forces people to experience estrangement, or never quite having the relationship they want. Because I hear it from both sides of the coin. I hear people that never have the relationship they want with the person they have in their lives, part of their families, and they desperately want that, but they can't because the other person just is not emotionally available to do that, right? To foster that connection. And we have the other side, of course, which is the idea that, they had enough. And there's actually a very liberating feeling when people have made that choice, because it's not an easy choice to make, but sometimes you have to. And you may have heard this word, actually. I think this was the most popular word last year. I think it was gaslighting. So some of you may have heard this word before. What is gaslighting? What is that exactly? Gaslighting is when you start to question your very reality. When people basically cause you to say, no, that never happened, or you're imagining this, or you're saying it wrong, and maybe you've had this sometimes in some family gatherings where somebody's going to come up and maybe do that to you. And it's a form of invalidation, because if this happens over time, then this is where doubt starts to get set in, and you become very defensive and reactive when you start to see that particular family member, if it's just one person, of course. And one of the things that I like to say to people is that there's nothing wrong with us, that there's always a silver lining of dignity and beauty, that we're all walking if we have to experience this. Because if we didn't choose this and this was subject onto us, it makes it harder because of that, right? So I often say to people that in some family situations, it's good to not participate in power games. You don't want to have to participate in some of these power games that, bring out some of these power players basically in the family if you don't agree with them, where they can start to throw their weight around in some ways, right? And you see this happen every now and then, And a lot of people will seek to elevate themselves at our expense as well, and that's the thing that happens. I find oftentimes that what feeds estrangement is this notion of power, this attempt at domination. It's never an equal relationship where both people are equal with each other. There's always one trying to dominate the other, And when we experience that, it's not a feel-good feeling, because why be in competition with people, And that's the thing that happens, I find, especially that's difficult when it comes to that. So it does give a sense of relief to some people when they free themselves of that, but it causes some people, of course, to question their experiences in their family. And I often find that when we're in families, we're like, it's like a blank page for us. It's like when we're young, we're children, for example, we're born in a family. We don't know, right? We're taking it all in for the first time, and we're learning more about ourselves, right? But there ends up happening, getting a baggage of some sort that we start to have over time, And it's interesting because I think it was Carl Jung that said that it takes us about 50 years to find out who we are, 40 or 50 years, and it's the other 40 or 50 years that we need to deconstruct all the stuff that we accumulated over time that no longer serves us, right? So I thought that was really interesting, because that's kind of a lot of the work that ends up happening. And a lot of the people I work with are actually, 50 plus people that I end up asking these same questions. How do I free myself from this, Because you don't talk about this outside the outside world, and it's always good to create a space to do that. So there's people that are narcissistic, and that's another word maybe you've heard getting tossed around. A lot of times we hear this word, but I'm not diagnosing anybody when it comes to using that word, but I find that there's traits that are present in some people. There's some people that have that, And if you notice it really carefully, the way in which it looks like is that they have a lack of empathy, right? They don't really care as much. They don't care about other people's feelings, And you can often feel as though it's a one-sided relationship when it comes to them. It can be very conditional, and you have to work hard at proving yourself or your worth rather than being accepted just the way you are. And this is the thing that happens in some families that cause estrangement. Oftentimes I hear about this, that there's this narcissistic person that somehow thinks they're making all the decisions for everybody and telling us how we should live our lives, And oftentimes we can feel coerced or controlled. We can get the sense that the other person's attempting to dominate us, as we were saying earlier. We can feel as though we're being manipulated or used and such, Of course, transgressing their boundaries is something that they like to do. They like to transgress boundaries that people set. So you really have to work hard at setting boundaries to make sure that they're not interfering in your life in certain ways. So that's just something to be mindful of whenever you get together with some people in the family. Sometimes there's some people that are healthy people, and sometimes there's some people that are unhealthy. So a lot of times people tell me about their action plan. They're going to be going to a family function, and they tell me, how should I protect myself? And we'd go into some strategies to help them out, of course, to make things better for themselves, you know. One of the strategies I mentioned is, you know, foster an exit strategy. If things go from bad to worse, know when you can leave, you know. And I've had some people tell me it takes about an hour and a half for them. 90 minutes later, they know the conversation is going to go wrong. It's all right, there's pleasantries in the beginning, it goes very well, but then it starts to turn gradually. So they know when to leave just about at that time. So it's really interesting. So it's really different for each family, I think, especially. But if you can kind of grab that and understand that, then you know that you can only spend so much time with some family members before it starts to go haywire. So some people discuss with me, they say that some people like that tend to make them walk on eggshells, have unexpected or sudden eruptions in some ways, right? You don't know what's going on here, you know? How did it happen that this person just like went overboard, right? And it does happen, of course, and that's the thing that makes it really hard, because this is, of course, the type of situation that causes us to grieve the relationship. You know, even though the person's still with us, in front of us, we're never quite getting what we want. We're never quite getting the relationship we want because they can't have that emotional depth, because they're busy feeding off of us. They're feeding off of other people for their own validation. So that is one of the things that causes estrangement, you know, in some families, because if you don't have that type of relationship with somebody, you can almost be thirsting for that, for the person you would hope for them to be. And this is the thing that happens, is people hit themselves against the wall enough times that they understand that the person is just not going to change. They're going to be that way, you know, maybe for the rest of their lives, you know. So sometimes we have to protect ourselves from people like that. So I just wanted to mention that some of these are the elements to consider, of course, when it comes to estrangement, and things to watch out for that can cause estrangement, you know. And it's oftentimes not our choice, but sometimes it is. And sometimes it starts off as not being our choice, but we end up, you know, being okay with it. Because it's like, phew, finally, I'm okay. I don't have to, you know, bend in different ways to be able to you know, go to this family function and go through that same song and dance all over, you know. So that's really, really important to be able to recognize that. So I could say a lot more about narcissists, but for now, that's just a bit of a bird's eye view, I think, with regards to that, as being one of the contributors to estrangement. So I guess I'll go through the different types of mourning when it comes to this type of loss, especially. And this type of mourning is something that can be associated also to grieving the passing of a loved one as well. So I've adapted it, of course, to estrangement, but it can adapt very well to different losses. And this is Warden's Tasks of Mourning, is what it's called. So as I said earlier, we've heard a lot about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, right? In general culture, we hear about it in TV shows, less about Warden. So this will be a chance to maybe know a little bit more about these 4 stages. So number 1 is quite simply the stage of accepting the reality of the loss, right? So acknowledge the reality of the loss, you know, feel the feelings associated to the loss. Try to do that, you know, in as safe of a way as possible, of course, you know. Estrangement is its own particular type of loss, and if we're not careful, then, you know, we can fall into a defense mechanism that causes us to ignore our feelings, right? As we were saying earlier, you know. So recognizing the feelings is the first step in seeing it from the outside to start to work on it. That's number 1, right? Number 2 is to process the pain of grief, right? Are you able to name the feelings you're going through? Where do you feel them in your body? That's a great question to ask, because oftentimes, you know, we can make it into a bit of a head trick. But if we start to ask, where am I feeling that in the body, you know? And oftentimes we feel our feelings in our chest area or in our stomach, but sometimes maybe in our shoulders, maybe in our necks, maybe in our back, you know? Sometimes it happens. So be conscious of where you're feeling that. And I often find that if you can do a bit of a word association also is a good way of understanding the feelings. So if you can do that, find words that fit. So it's a little bit like a hot and cold game. I sometimes do this with some people where we kind of use some words. Does that word fit? Like a puzzle. Does that fit? If it does, okay, let's use that. Let's acknowledge that feeling's telling you this, you know? And I often find whatever bodily sensation people have, you know, we can use that to get more information about it, just to better understand ourselves in general. So sometimes I even go so far as to say, like, what's that feeling telling you? Like, if it could speak, like, what would it say? So I get really creative with it. And you can use active imagination. A lot of my work does involve the tools of active imagination because we can get a lot of information about ourselves when it comes to that. So that's a really important way of working with it. And number 3 is to adjust to the world without our sibling or family member. You know, was there anything that you were discouraged by your sibling or family member to do and such? You know, and it's always good to explore and to develop those abilities as a means of freeing ourselves from negative influences, right? If you're told all your life, oh, you're no good at doing that, you know, well, why not try? Why not see for yourself instead of buying into their own vision of you, right? So that's really, really important, you know. So we've talked about external adjustments that we can do for ourselves, and we've talked about internal adjustments, and some internal adjustments can have to do with looking at ourselves completely and authentically. You know, I think that's really, really important to be able to look at ourselves authentically without commentary. Because oftentimes we tend to do that. We add commentary to our experience, oftentimes. Oh, I'm too this, oh, I'm too that. Oh, I shouldn't feel that way. Well, why not? Let yourself feel what you're feeling. Let yourself see yourself the way you are. So I have different exercises to help people to foster authenticity, because we forget about that. You know, and I find that that's often important for us to experience as a whole, you know. And it's always good to differentiate ourselves, as I was saying, with regards to an estranged family member's view of us. And also, you know, spiritually speaking, you know, it's good to recognize that our view of the world has been shaken up when it comes to, of course, estrangement or the passing of someone, you know. And it's important to work on our limiting beliefs and to, I would say, relearn to recognize that the world is basically a good place. Oftentimes, if we've been in an unsafe family or a family that there's been too much turbulence or volatility or people just not being very nice or empathic towards us in some ways, then it becomes really important to recognize that and to get the idea that there's a sense in the world. That the world makes sense, right? That's really important for us to re-experience that, of course, you know. And also that you yourself are a worthy person. I find oftentimes that's the thing that comes up often with some people, is that there's a sense of unworthiness. Because if you're told all your life you're this or that, then it gets frustrating because you can almost buy into the message. And that's where the deconstructing happens. You kind of need to let go of that baggage over time to make yourself stronger, to see yourself truly as you are, you know. And that's the thing that's really, really important in all of this. So this is what's going to help us to break free of limiting family relationships when need be, especially. So number 4, and this is the part that I particularly enjoy as well, is the reassessing the role our sibling or our family can have in the midst of embarking on a new life. So it can sometimes mean that certain family members may need to be relegated to a lesser position with us. And this is the hard thing, because oftentimes, you know, we don't like to have to do that. We don't like to somehow have to somehow put people in a position that is less in our lives, less present, less affecting us in some ways. But sometimes we have to do that for our own well-being, you know. And it's crucial, because if we're not careful, you know, our expectations can get the best of us, and we can foster suffering when it comes to how we're supposed to see family versus how it is in reality. So we have this vision about how family should be, right? But oftentimes it's not how it is. So sometimes you're faced with this particular reality, and you have to adjust to that reality, right? So I often find that it's necessary to treat people accordingly for our own benefit or for our own well-being, you know, oftentimes. Because if we don't, that can catch up to us in different ways. So defining our notion of family in a different way can be an important step in getting beyond the value conflict that we can experience with ourselves. And I think that this is always a work in progress. And this is a pivotal step oftentimes with the people that I work with in my community especially. You know, so this is a process. These 4 steps are a process, of course, you know. And of course, you can adapt this to a person that's deceased as well, right? Because they're all automatically going into a different position because they're not there. So you can use that. But what does that mean now that they're less present? How do you want to live your life from now on? And those are the questions that are really important to ask, ultimately. It always comes back down to that. You know, how do you want to live? So I'll end it on that question, because that's an important question for us to have, ultimately. And all of us are trying to answer that question, even now. So I thank you very much. I'm really happy to have been here and to be able to share with regards to all this, and it pleases me to see that there's a great number of people such as you that are here that are interested in learning more about this, because there's different losses, and it's really important that we understand how these different losses can affect us in different ways. So thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Ali-John. You gave us a lot to think about. A lot, but you can see how it all connects. So I suggest now we have some lovely goodies over there and coffee, and if someone would like tea, we can make that. And we'll take, how about we take 15 minutes and formulate some questions for Ali-John? How does that sound?